the way to think about the brain is think of it as you have this cognitive tank of resources that you start your day with. And then everything we ask the brain to do during that day is going to drain the resources. And classically, what would happen.
Dr. Greg Kelly, welcome to the Everyday Millionaire podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Your bio is very, very interesting. And as I, suggest to all my guests that it never really does justice to who the individual is that we're talking to. And I like to open the conversations to give our listeners some insights when somebody says to you, Dr. Greg, what do you do? What's your answer to that question these days?
Yeah, so these days I'm the vice president of product development at a brand called Qualia Life. And we do a lot educating about the brain and longevity and making products to help people improve those areas. And my particular role is to stay up to date with research, to be guests on cool podcasts like this, and ultimately to help the world know a bit more about how they can use their brain more efficiently and how they can age more gracefully.
So this is a very naturopathic journey that you're taking people on, and suggesting it. Am I correct in that kind of statement?
Yeah. So by degree, a naturopath, though I think of that as my second career. I started out as an officer in the US Navy in the 80s. And
Wow.
after that time period, found naturopathic medicine and then got a degree in that in 96. And since then have been, somewhere in and around the health world ever since.
So what got you on to this path? I mean, you came out of military and into this. I mean, that's quite a divergence, I think. But what inspired you to go that direction?
Yeah, so a few things. So one, when I first got in the Navy, it occurred to me pretty quickly that I had no idea how to feed myself. And for the first time in my life, I was somewhat responsible. I mean, I could eat on the ship some of the time, but before that, I grew up in a home where my mom, had that traditional role of being a housekeeper and made great food for us in college, meal plan, lived in a fraternity, we had a chef. So
Hmm.
I never had to worry about that piece. And one of the young officers that was in the first place I was stationed, which was Coronado, California, was that bodybuilder type of mold, right? And I figured, oh, he knows what he's doing, so let me pick his brain. And at the time, so this was 1984, the book he recommended was called Eat to Win by, I believe,
Hmm.
Elson Haas was
I
the.
remember that book. It was a big seller. It was a bestseller for sure.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. And for the people that wouldn't be familiar with it, it was a high complex carbohydrate,
Yep.
so brown rice, baked potatoes, that type of thing. Wow, very low fat approach. And at the time, that became my blueprint. So I was the weird officer on my first ship that would, like bring food to the ship if we were going out to sea for a week. And that became somewhat of a gym rat. So I never became big like that particular person, but within the confines of my genetics, I've always stayed in pretty good shape. So that, like, really from the get go in the Navy, there was that health piece I had dialed in. But on the flip side of that, I was a big drinker. So my life always at that time felt out of balance. Like if I was out at sea, I was sleep deprived, my body clock was disrupted, but I ate well and exercised within the constraints there. If I was in port, I exercised and ate well, but partied too much. So it was
Mm.
always almost like that. I just think in hindsight, like that out of balance. And towards the end of the Navy, a variety of things like balance just kind of fell into my life in a more meaningful way. And at that point, the Navy wasn't a great fit. So this was 89. And I decided to get out and just pursue whatever life held in store. Moved to Hawaii, started taking classes at the University of Hawaii, and a whole bunch of things. My original
Oh,
degree was engineering, so I
yeah.
had just exclusively engineering content. I didn't have any liberal arts types of courses, and eventually kind of started designing a program around medical and nutritional anthropology. And so my master's at the time was in Thai language and culture, but a lot of my emphasis was on how plants were used to keep people healthy in that part of the world. And around that same time, I stumbled on a naturopathic doctor that was teaching a yoga class that I started to go to, and thought like, wow, here's a profession that's doing not only that, but a whole bunch more. And instead of just learning about it, applying it. And so I shifted gears, went to naturopathic school in 93, and the rest is kind of history. So that, like, really quick, that's how, my journey progressed to where I am.
Sure, those are a lot of years you covered in a short time, so that's
Yeah.
all understood. Now, when you look at naturopathic and you now have honed in on the brain, I'm sure that was a progression when you looked at, the holistic view of the body and what kind of supports health. Did you come to the focus on the brain uh, intentionally, or did it just evolve into that? Because there's a lot of research that's been done on that. I follow it because I'm very holistic in my own health. Uh, I have an interest in it. And so I'm curious. There's a lot of data around how to better support the brain and the brain function and all of that goes with it. How did you get to that?
So I would say my main interest has always been, and this is, the transition from the Navy into what became naturopathic medicine, that mind body interface. So my particular journey, like what one of the things that I would say transformed me was, I had mentioned I was a big drinker. The Navy at some point said, okay, like enough's enough. Let's, send you to alcohol rehab. So that would have been spring of '88. And somewhat independent of what was going on there, but just things that came up that I often took, like, made myself to do what was a hard thing to do in the moment. I viewed that time period as one Greg walked in, the one that was addicted to alcohol, and one walked out, one that wasn't. There was like some profound mind body shift that happened because of actions I took. And so before even naturopathic medicine, that was my, I guess, frame of reference. Like, wow, we can really transform. It's not easy, and there's no, recipe that I knew of that could cause other people to have what happened for me. Because the truth is, of the people I went through, most of them like walked out pretty much the same person, just not drinking. So that drove a lot of, and I think this would be common for most people. It's our own individual challenges that often shape what we're most interested in. So ever since that time period, I've been always fascinated with, is there things or technologies we can do to really change someone's beliefs and change who they show up in the world as? And the brain is obviously front and center in that. So I always crazy interest in the brain, and then I've just had the opportunity over my career to learn and more and become, at least, I don't think anyone's an expert on the brain. There's
Yeah.
just too much going on, but to really, have a sense of what matters for most of us to show up as better versions of ourselves.
When you consider the journey of looking at holistic being naturopathic in, I guess, an attitude, if you will. So I've always had a fundamental belief that, I don't want to ever have to go to a medical doctor. I always want to take and be responsible for my own physical, mental, emotional health. And so I went on that journey, many, many years ago. And so started to understand that, from my perspective, the mental and physical connection. So in other words, I believe that, this is my own belief, by the way, is, and I have lots of evidence of it in not only myself, but others, which is, how we think and what we think about can actually manifest as illness in physically. And when I started that journey, and I'll just share this with you, and I'd like you to kind of go and what's your view of it and how you see it. I remember I was studying Dr. Wayne Dyer back in the early days of when he was writing, and what he talked about was that mental physical connection. How we think about things can manifest physically, and that was a stretch back then for me to go, wow, I think that, how does that work? But he gave me an example, and he goes, consider an ulcer. It is pretty much accepted that an ulcer is caused by, I think, anxiety and worry and stress. And so think about that. That's a mental thing that manifests physically. And that was a great example. And that was for me a tipping point. I went, oh, I can connect that dot. I can see that. And then other evidence showed up is that, I haven't had a cold for more years than I can even remember. And be honest with you, I haven't been sick for more years than I can remember. And at times when if I had a cold, if I had a flu, I could always connect the dots to me feeling some level of stress or anxiety, or something was going on for me at that time. So that's just a little bit of my own experience and what I believe. But I'd be interested in, what research you've done or how you view that, given you're the expert here, not me.
Yeah, so I would agree, and usually the way it would be termed is that it's stored somatically, right? Like trauma, as an example,
Mhm.
is often stored in our body. So we're not consciously aware of where it's stored. We can't often access it because sometimes the trauma happened, before we actually even have memories, or our brain has done things to make it so that we don't have access to that memory. But yeah, so those things get stored in the body and show up then over time as maybe that individual's Achilles heel, so to speak,
Mhm.
right? And so one of the things I saw, when I worked more directly with patients, I did a fair amount of what I think of as NLP, or neuro
Yep.
linguistic programming type of
Sure.
approaches, and that sometimes, like one example, right? And this can be different, but I'll just give you a personal example. So I've never had allergies. And I think of allergies as more like a threshold thing, right? If we're above a certain exposure, most of us will have it. Some people are more sensitive. But at the time, I had moved to northern Idaho, was living in Sandpoint. I'd found this really cool old down Army Navy-ish sleeping bag. And it was end of September. I'm like, oh, cool. I'll just take it and go, sleep outside in the woods tonight. And I woke up that morning with crazy allergies.
Mm.
So I did, herbal things, naturopathic protocols
Yep.
to try to, dampen the allergies, and figured like, oh, physiologically makes sense. Maybe, something, the down, something, right? Even though I've never been allergic to down in the past. And, so, most of that day passed, allergies were still as bad as when I woke up. And lying down that night, I just started to almost have what I think of as a self dialogue, and just said, the part of me that really knows what's going on here, help me out here, because I don't know. But I want to make sure that whatever you really need is, something I help you get. And I just had this flash in my brain of, I don't ever want you to be cold like that again. So the part of the
Mhm.
story I left out is that night was really cold,
Mhm.
and the down wasn't even, so it was a cold night sleeping outside in nature. And I said,
Yeah.
like, well, I don't ever want to be that cold again. How about I just use my other sleeping bag? And it was like, great. And I just literally felt the allergies just like almost like a line went down from my top of my head through my body, just scrubbing them away. So, that's just a story. But I've seen lots of things like that working with people, where there's almost this really crazy, profound mind body connection, where the part maybe responsible for a symptom in that case wants something good for us. We don't
Mhm.
understand what that is. It hasn't really communicated it. And at the end of the day, we're dissatisfied with the symptom. But if we knew the intent, then often we'd be like, yeah, cool, I would want that too. And so, a big part of the brain is it's the interface there. But what often happens is things that are stored in our body, one, we're not skilled at having the a simple conversation I did, two, maybe we have it, but we get no insight. And three, some things, like I said, are just stored so deeply. It's almost like the brain's protecting us from ever
Sure.
knowing what happened. So, I would be of the same mindset as you, that many, many common health problems have some part of if not are primarily part with the brain being involved. And I think the general statistics in medicine is something like 80% of all conditions have at least stress as a contributor, maybe not the cause, but at a minimum, making things worse.
Yeah, and I've actually heard that it was even more than 80%. And I've come to believe that and witness it over the years. I'll just share a really quick story, which is I had uh, a member of my team, this was several years ago, but he was just a great guy. I loved him, and to this day he's still a friend. But he worked with me or for me for many years, and literally, I would call him into my office because he was one of those guys that would go off the rails and, screw up in some level. And I knew that, with my approach to him, I really had to be quite assertive. And I don't mean yelling, screaming, not that way. I'm talking about just really direct. It's kind of like, don't mince words. Don't think he's going to read between the lines. Just state it. And I didn't have to do it often, but it was like a once a year thing or a couple times a year. But my point is this: every time I had that really direct conversation, he would walk in my office healthy, and I would watch him physically break down right in front of my eyes. So by the end of a 45-minute conversation, his throat was plugged up, he was sniffling, he was literally like he had symptoms of a cold. And that was pretty consistent. And to the point where I finally, said to him, I go, dude, you carry this way too heavy. This is just a conversation. And I watch you physically break down in front of me when we have these conversations, lighten up. And so he got it, and then it went away as soon as I shone a light on it, when it totally changed our relationship too, by the way. But my point is that I watched him physically break down. And, there's a phrase that I've become quite connected to, and that is that it's not the weight that we carry that breaks us down. It's the way we carry the weight. And that phrase comes from watching and observing not just myself, but others in terms of how they carry stress, how they carry the challenges that we face in life and business and relationship, whatever that might be. And it ultimately, if we carry it heavy, it will in fact physically manifest in some way, generally is my experience. So the point of all that, I guess, is that it goes back to the book that, don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. And, if we stay connected to that kind of thought process, I think from a physical health point of view, it's healthy, even and mental health. When you started getting into and started, kind of on your journey of investigating what the brain was there a fork in the road moment, or was there something that you observed for yourself or for others? Again, when you went that direction and kind of specialized in it, is my understanding, was there a catalyst for it?
Well, at the time, a good friend. So there's a someone named Bredesen that's pioneered a lot of work in approaching people with dementia. Um, Usually, like using a multiple nutrient, like a very naturopathic approach. And a medical doctor friend of mine wanted me to help him just to research a bunch of ingredients that were in that Bredesen protocol, and some that might be useful that weren't for him. So that I think from a nutritional perspective, and what I now think of as nootropics, like substances we can take to help the brain. At that point, so that was 2017, I think, really shifted my emphasis to being much more focused on the brain, where before I would have been more general in terms of, I was doing things, I would say health writ large, so all systems of the body. And since then, both the brain, but aging, right, the aging brain, as well as aging in other systems, has been my overwhelming emphasis. So I would say he was the catalyst. And then, got a job opportunity with the company called Qualia. And our focus at the time was on the brain. Our podcast was very brain-centric as well. So I've, had the opportunity to interview a fair number of really exceptional people that have books or research related to the
Mm-hmm.
brain. So I'll give some credit to Dr. Hassi, the MD I mentioned.
So when we look at, and for somebody listening and going, okay, well, what would be something that they should be considering, when you talk about nootropics and the kind of the supplements and things that support our health? Is there signs that somebody would say, is it brain fog? Is it not sleeping well? Is it uh, slow recall? I don't know. What are some signals that somebody may be at the effect of something and saying, okay, there's some things to clean up, whether it be in your diet or supplements that need to be taken that can support it. I take supplements. I take some supplements, have for years and years and years, consistently the same. They work for me, and that's how I look at it. I go, I'm healthy, so something's working. But what is it for you that if you were to, give the suggestion to listeners as signals, if you will?
Yeah, so I think the things you mentioned for sure, right? So um, that general idea of brain fog, which often means like slow, muddled. Like we're aware that our brain just isn't the high performance engine that it's been at other times of our lives is a big one. Um, I think of like mood types of things, right? So you mentioned stress, feelings of occasional anxiety, depression. It's not unusual to have ebbs and flows in those. So on their own, they're not, like like a symptom or a warning. But if we're feeling like we're spending a lot of time in those states, right, or stuck in them, that would be a sign. Issues with sleep, the same. The brain's doing a lot of work during sleep. um, I always look at things like, so just for the listeners, when you think of the brain from a health perspective, they usually say, okay, the brain does all these different jobs. And if you were to look in the DSM-5, which is what doctors would use to diagnose issues with the brain, they group those into six big buckets. So one's called attention, one's called executive function, one's called social cognition, one's language, one's memory, and the last one is visual motor. So like really think of like, moving through space
Mm-hmm.
with our senses. And the attention one, you'll often see issues showing up there, right? So that's, difficulty with getting focused on something or not being able to maintain your focus or allowing things to distract you easily. Those things would all be in the focus bucket. And the executive function, you also see lots of challenges. So executive function for listeners, just think of that as the suite of things we need our brain to do to be really successful in whatever our profession is, right? So it's things like, being able to avoid distractions, to change our mind when it's appropriate, to that's called cognitive flexibility, to have more working memory, which is what our brain does to hold information in the brain while it's working with it. So almost like the RAM on our computer. So executive function just becomes a really I guess sign, right? When someone's stressed out, you'll usually see working memory tank. And the simple story about executive function is it's what allows our brain to do the right thing when it's the hard thing. So if we're showing up in our life doing the easy thing time after time instead of the harder thing, then we probably don't have enough resources to do the executive function that we need. And then the last thing I always look at would be social cognition. So social cognition is your empathy, your ability to control our own emotions, like our own emotional responses to things. So when we're a grouchy, irritable coworker or a really angry boss, we might be doing great in attention and executive function, but running out of gas when it comes to social cognition. So what I usually want to see is someone that's balanced across all of those. They're able to use their attention when and how they need it. They have good executive function, and that they're socially someone that has good skills. Right there, I going back to my time in the Navy, I had a captain of one of my ships that was much more on that grouchy, like you didn't want to get on his bad side. Another captain that was much more chill. Like you want that right balance. You want a good coach, right? That can give
Mm-hmm.
us feedback, but not in a like yelling and screaming kind of way. So, anyways, I would look at all those things. And what usually happens with the brain works, and this gets a little bit back, I think, to your story about the person that would come in, right? That like we want to have more capacity to take in feedback without it ruffling our feathers.
Mm-hmm.
So the way to think about the brain is think of it as you have this cognitive tank of resources that you start your day with. And it's probably for most of us, that's when it's going to be the fullest, assuming we got a decent night's sleep. And then everything we ask the brain to do during that day is going to drain the resources a little bit. And classically, what would happen, and my dad, this would have been a truism for his generation and him in particular. So my dad worked as an executive. He was president eventually of a 5,000 person engineering firm in Boston. We probably only lived 30 miles away from Boston, but ridiculously long commute to go in and
Mhm.
out. And so what would happen is my dad would use up most of those cognitive resources during work, during the
Mhm.
commute, and get home at the end of the day. And more often than not, we would have somewhat of a easily aggravated version of my dad that would walk in the door. And I know we often felt like we were, on our tiptoes, right? Like, had to be really well behaved. And then my dad, would shine his shoes, read the paper, do things like that. And, after dinner, he would be the more normal version of my dad,
Mhm.
right? And the way I would understand that now with understanding the brain is my dad just had used everything up, all those cognitive resources. By the time that person walked in the door at 6:30 at night, it was depleted. So he couldn't maintain that, like that social cognition, right? Like
Sure.
manage his emotions. But having an opportunity to replenish some of those, with both dinner and relaxing activities, then he could better. And he would be the archetype. We see that all the time in our society, right? We don't always show up the best versions of ourselves. We're much more likely to show up a poor version at the end of our day when our brain's already, been somewhat exhausted than at the beginning of our day. And, often, even during the day. Um, you know, there's time periods where, like classically mid-afternoon, people are slightly less resourceful versions of themselves, right? They've kind of depleted a whole bunch and haven't restored it. And what we really need to restore is more often than not just giving our brain opportunities to do something very different than whatever it's been doing for the last hour or couple hours. So, for me, I spend a lot of time reading research and on my computer. So, a restoration break means maybe walking around the block and looking at clouds or listening to the ocean, right? We need to use our brain very differently to give it a chance to replenish. And then the other piece, and this is where nootropics come in my mind, is these compounds we can take. So think of supplements for the brain. They actually give us more resources to start the day and to make it through the day. So what I would routinely see in people that use nootropics that agree with them is that they are more productive during the day. They have more energy. That kind of takes that mental fog out of or brain fog out of the equation. But quite often, what you also see is those, you know, I guess that dip in the afternoon goes away, or we show up at the tail end of our day being better versions of ourselves and getting home and still having the juice to go to the gym or to be more kind and gracious to the people we love the best.
So I love where you're going with where you went with that conversation. It brought up a couple of things for me, and number one is that we sometimes look and say, okay, we need more discipline, we need more willpower, we need to do something more of. In other words, we're very critical of ourselves. I go back to for myself, I look at it and go, a lot of this is self-awareness and know thyself and then be true to thyself. And I put that in place to precede the thought processes. A lot of this is based on understanding, being aware of what you've got going on. So your dad, for example, back in those days or back then may not, he just he was the way he was, and then went through his process, wound down, then was the dad that you wanted him to be. And he's a lot more caring, loving, listening, whatever the story is. He may not have had the awareness of what he was actually dealing with. Is Do you think that part of the challenge that people face is they don't have an awareness, number one, of how they're showing up, and or they think it's just the way I am, without any understanding that, hold it, step back, how do you operate the best? I think you said something that I'm very attuned to. I do a lot of research, I do a lot of writing. I can be absolutely shut down by the end of the day mentally, but if I look after myself throughout the day, get outside, get some sun, get some air, go for a quick walk, like a 5-10 minute break, kind of vitalizes and or kind of smooths out the process, if you will. Now that's what works for me. But do you think the first is that how does somebody self-assess? What you described. Is there a you offer a test? Is there something that I could look at and self-assess where I'm at?
Yeah, I'm sure there are questionnaires, but issue is that these things tend to be blind spots for us, right?
Yes.
So we're not the best reads, and I think of there's the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm sure you've probably heard of it, but
Mhm.
their original paper I think was called "Unskilled and Unaware of It."
Mm.
And the general gist of it for listeners is the same skills it takes to be good at something are there skills we need to be aware we're not good at it. And so I think of like when I years ago when it was new on TV, American Idol, I would watch the beginning episodes. I found those the most entertaining because you'd have really bad singers, and often they thought they were good, and then much
Mhm.
better. So I could tell the difference between the two of them. But once it got past those early stages, they were all great singers to me. Where the judges that were much more skilled could tell the difference. But one of the things that stood out to me was that okay, you have these people that are you know as bad as singers as I would be, but that thought they were good, right? So that's your classic unskilled and unaware of it. And so that's true for most things that, um, you know, often it's not our fault that we aren't doing well. We haven't built the skills, and it takes a lot of work often to build the skills. And in the midst of building them is when we finally realize, oh my God, I'm awful at this. But if we've not invested that time, where and I use the word delusion a lot, and not in a judgmental way, but just to mean that we're not great reads on our skills in this area. So empathy would be an example. Um, Many people actually are aware that they're not great at empathy, but to be aware of it, they've built some degree now of skill. The people that are usually the worst at empathy aren't aware that they're awful at it.
Mm.
And the people that, do get better at it, it's because they either were born with a high level of it, but cultivate that almost like a muscle. And so I think it's really hard. So my dad, as an example, was definitely aware that he was almost overloaded at the end of the day and needed his routine to get back to a good place. But I don't think he was aware how he showed up when he walked
Mhm.
in the door any more than, in areas where I've not been as good, I've been, great early either. And it's why I think feedback is really important. The what's the saying? Something like feedback's the breakfast of champions, right? Without like putting things out into the sensory world and getting feedback, we can't learn. And my default is that most of us despise feedback. Even I, who know how important feedback is and have given people permission to give it to me, don't often like it in the moment I'm getting it. And so that's just been my experience. But without feedback, it's really hard to change. And we're not great at taking feedback from others. And often the feedback the universe is trying to give us, for lack of a better way to describe it, we're blaming on other things, right? So rather than, I guess, going back to the example you were giving, that person was having crazy things going on in their body. It sounded
Mhm.
like when you were giving them feedback, and it would be very easy for them now to just say, "Oh, I'm having these things because of you," and blame you rather than say, "I have these things going on in my body. What does that mean?"
Mhm.
Right? So, and that's the piece I think that's always important, and it's that piece that fell into place for me in the alcohol rehab timeframe. So, one of the pivotal things happened at the end of the first week. The Navy person that was just speaking to the big group at the end of the day on Friday just said, "Oh, by the way, we need the addresses and contacts for your family members so we can let them know, what you're going through and send them information." And right away, crazy resistance from me. It's like, heck no. Like, there's no way I'm giving you my parents' information or anything else. And I use the idea of bandwidth. So we have a certain amount of mental bandwidth that's constantly being used, and some of that it's because of background conversations. So that bandwidth is 100% consumed, it seemed like, from that moment until I went to bed that night with me coming up with all these reasons why I'm not going to give the Navy what they want, why it wasn't their right, blah, blah, blah. And also understanding I'm an officer in the Navy, they're probably going to, at the end of the day, get what they want.
Mhm.
And the same, I woke up that next morning, really lousy night's sleep, still consumed my bandwidth, that, conversation I was having, and just said, all right, I'm never going to let anything consume me like this has over the last 12 hours. I went to a payphone because that's what existed in 1988, and put money in, called my parents thinking, oh, my mom's probably going to say, oh, this is a good thing. You've drank, too much for years. And my dad, who was a fairly big drinker, at least in my judgment, would have said, oh, like, I don't understand, and been angry, irritable about it. And I 100% called it wrong. My mom had no idea, like, was confused about things. My dad said, oh, I can hop on a plane and fly to Virginia from Boston. Virginia was where I was at the time, rent a hotel and be, nearby to support you during this. And that healed my relationship with my dad in that moment in a way that nothing, like, I got finally, for whatever reason, like in that moment, like, oh my God, my dad really loves me and is there for me. And I hadn't seen that before, like, it was a blind spot for me.
Mhm.
So, long story short, the signal for me has always been, if something grabs my bandwidth and really is like, resisting something that's seems like it's being put on me from the outside in, that's a clue there's probably something in me that really needs work or healing. And you mentioned Wayne Dyer. One of my, like, things I've always loved was this simple analogy he gave, and it was, I might misquote it, but he's in front of an audience and he says, "Oh, what happens when you squeeze an orange?" And the audience yells, "Oh, juice comes out." And then he said, "Well, why did the juice comes out?" And the audience is like, "Because you squeezed the orange." And his answer is like, "Yeah, but the juice was there." Right? So I think the world, the environment is always going to squeeze us. But if juice comes up, if something grabs, you know, Greg's bandwidth, it's because the juice is there. There's probably other people that heard that same thing as more of an invitation, and it didn't cause, like, a big reaction for them. So that's the
Mm.
clue to me, right? Like, when that occurs, and if it, is repetitive in a certain area, that's the sign that's a really sticky point for us that we'd benefit from working on.
So when you look at somebody that comes to is it sorry, my bad, Qualia or Nootropics, why do they seek you out? Why do they actually find you? Because I'm thinking about this and realizing that at some point somebody's got to go. This doesn't. I'm not dealing with things well. I've got too many, some issues of something, that they're searching for something. So why would they, in their search, come across you? Like, what is it that they're searching for that they end up in your feed, in your database somehow?
Yeah.
What's driving that?
Yeah, so, for nootropics, the main, like, nootropics, it really evolved with people from Silicon Valley, using these substances to help them perform better, and, students then embraced them at some universities. And so the key areas that often people, want more of, that leads them to using nootropic substances, would be a feeling of more energy. And
Mm,
just like simple sense, everything we ask our brain to do requires energy. And so energy often is a limiting factor. And if we want to feel like we have more energy, we got to support the brain's ability to make more. Another would be that idea of focus or attention, like being able to focus for longer where we want without distraction. And in the modern world, focus has become more and more challenging because of technology and, phones and you name it. And the third would be what I think of as motivation. So, productivity is often bundled in that, but, like, having kind of the juice and willpower to get started and to stay doing the harder thing rather than goofing around. And so usually when people come to nootropics, it's because they want one, but more commonly all three of those things.
mm,
Other reasons could be, better memory, sometimes the mood component, realizing that, they're more on that anxious, irritable, end of the continuum. And if they were to do something like more caffeine, it would just make that worse. And they want what I think of as more of a calm sense of energy than they're currently experiencing. So those would be the main areas that I see that both draw people to nootropics and that they benefit in when they take nootropic compounds. And then I guess the last piece of the puzzle would be, and I mentioned that idea of bandwidth, like, um, you know, energy, bandwidth, however you want to describe things. There's often like a constraint in, willpower, the amount of energy we have to get through the day, many of us realize that's constrained, right? We want to do more or be more than our brain seems to be able to let us currently. And
Mm,
nootropics are one of the things that adds more resources in. And with more resources, the brain often can do more, right? Like it's resource constrained. And if you add more into it, then it's just able to perform better. And often things that before may have been, like as an example, if I'm sleep deprived, I'm probably more likely to be triggered by something in the world around me. If my brain's already exhausted at the end of the day, maybe also more likely to be triggered. If it has
mhm.
more resources, those same things may be things that just pass right through. And so that's the other thing I see with people that take nootropics is that often because of the more resources, their brain's able to perform a bit better and they can move past areas that they were stuck in.
So, what is? I'm curious about nootropics. We haven't talked about this, but is there a secret formula? Is there, 5 different things? Because you mentioned something that when you were walking and talking about why people might end up searching you out and looking for product, is because caffeine is, because what you described, I'm going, okay, would you not just have another cup of coffee now? And I'm only kind of really kind of dumbing it down a little bit for conversation. So, and your comment was is that when somebody's, done, like, I can't do more caffeine, I need something. So when you look at nootropics, again, is this a product that you've developed over the years? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we have a couple different nootropics, but our premier one is called Qualia Mind. We can get a little bit more into that, but let's go back to caffeine since you brought it up. So
Mm,
caffeine would be, I would say, the most used nootropic substance on the planet.
mm,
Between coffee, tea, yerba mate, wherever a caffeine containing plant existed in the environment, the local people always found it, and most
yeah.
of those plants have now found themselves and used worldwide. And what caffeine does, and I mentioned that idea of attention. So I think of like cognition almost like a pyramid. At the bottom, we need to be alert and awake, right? And caffeine is the archetypal thing that does that really well, right? Like it promotes alertness, vigilance is often how it's described. And from that more vigilant state, attention often works better. And it's because of a network called there's the the brain is basically set up like networks of things that hub together and interconnect. And one of the networks is default mode network. And you can think of that as that's where the brain goes when we're not asking it to do anything focused. And so it's you're daydreaming, like you're zoned out type of brain activity. And what caffeine tends to do is it makes that network less active. It makes the ones that focus more active. So it allows more of the focus. But like most things, more is not better. So a useful heuristic for people listening is that idea of the Goldilocks rule, right? There's one bowl that's too cold, one that's too hot, and one that's just right. And caffeine's like that, right? Like, too little is probably not going to get us quite to the level of alertness that more might, but too much is not more in terms, it's not going to add more alertness. It's just going to now add more things like irritability and grouchiness and things that in naturopathic medicine we would have described as caffeineism. And so adding more caffeine isn't the solution to get more alertness or these other things higher up the pyramid, like executive function. So caffeine doesn't do a great job on executive functions. And caffeine can often, especially if someone has a lot, it can make them more irritable and grouchy. So what you see is like energy, but not focused energy, and often not the most pleasant energy if someone does too much caffeine. So the way things evolved in the nootropic world was okay, let's see if we can stack other things together with something like caffeine to get more out of it. And the archetypal stack is something that's thought of as caffeine and a compound called theanine. And theanine is an amino acid like compound that comes from green tea, as an example.
Mhm.
And if you were to give L-theanine on its own, what you would see is alpha brain waves. So those are more relaxed brain waves become more prominent. And if you give that theanine with caffeine, what you often see is someone would have a sense of much more calm energy. So they get the good things of caffeine, but in a much more calmer, subjective state where they're able to stay focused longer and be more productive. Like one of the things I think of with high doses of caffeine, it gives us the sense that we're doing a lot more, but we're often doing a lot of those things less accurately.
Mhm.
So theanine helps balance that. And then other things that happen, or that were then later added on or experimented with, had often to do with the dopamine system, right? So dopamine, most people know that is the neurotransmitter that's all about reward. But really what dopamine is, it's something that's secreted in advance of the reward that tells our body we think it's likely that the investment of resources you're going to put into this is
Yeah.
going to be rewarding. So let's do it, right? So it's about motivation and guessing about the future and things like that. But that system ends up being super important for motivation and productivity and learning. And the other one is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is made from something in our diet called choline. But acetylcholine is all about neuroplasticity and attention and learning and memory. And they're wrapped up together because to learn and remember, we have to focus our attention first.
Mm.
And so, like a quick way to think about it is that idea of 10,000 hours. So, for listeners, you've probably heard this idea we have to invest quite a bit of time often to become expert. The thing that's not often mentioned is it has to be focused attention. Otherwise, we're not going to get much better, right? We need feedback because we always need that feedback loop. And then we need acetylcholine because acetylcholine is what allows the brain's landscape to be altered to allow for the learning and memory. So I always think of it as without acetylcholine, 10,000 hours, even invested wisely, would be largely wasted. So we just need more of these neurotransmitters and these other substances often if we're going to get more from the brain for whatever we're investing in, whether it's our job or school, you name it. And so, what we did at the Qualia brand over time, going back to 2015, we just started experimenting by building lots of these recipes, so to speak, and testing them out till we found one that seemed really reliably to help people in those big areas, that sense of mental energy, focus, and motivation.
How big of an impact in your experience, and I know, I mean, I have some idea what the answer likely is, but what I've come to learn for myself is that sleep is really important. I don't need a lot of it. So, in other words, for me, my sweet spot is 6 to 6.5 hours. I occasionally will sleep 7. I could count on one hand the number of times I'll sleep 8 hours in a night over the course of a year. Now, I don't wake up to a alarm clock ever, and I'm pretty consistent. If I'm asleep by 11, I'm gold, and I'm going to get out of bed, and I'm up and at it usually by 5:30. Now, if that gets disrupted and I end up occasionally because of the nature of sometimes what I do, because I'm in the West Coast and I'm dealing with individuals on the East Coast or Central Canada, my time zones, I'm up really early sometimes for meetings, etc. Now the point is that I find at some point caffeine is just the worst thing for me in terms of if I've only had, let's say, 4 hours of sleep or even 5 hours, a cup of coffee, and then after that, the worst thing I can do is add caffeine to it. But how important is sleep? And when you consider what you just talked about, does that cause disruption to sleep? How much even does the endless scrolling that many get caught in, myself included, have been part of that? How disruptive is that to our sleep and even how our brain functions, given that we're looking for that dopamine, whether we are aware of it or not? I don't know if there's a direct question in there other than, when we talk about sleep, what are some of the things that you've learned about sleep?
Yeah. So sleep's a foundational piece, right? So I think there's our hypothalamus is part of our brain that really I think of as what controls survival. So what you would see there is core survival things like how much we eat, so appetite, thirst regulation, body temperature regulation, sleep needs, how much body fat we carry, our body clock, they're all regulated in that area. So sleep is, one of those foundational things um, that we need. And then the way kind of sleep works is the same as any of those things that are self-regulated. So that part of our brain largely decides how much sleep we need and tries to make sure we attain it. And there's differences. Like, if you hear 8 hours of sleep is what we need, I don't think that's even an accurate average. It's probably somewhere closer to 7 to 7.5. But some people need more, some people
Mm.
a little bit less, few people, a small percent, much less. So those are usually thought of as short sleepers, people that, maybe 4.5 or 5 hours, they're fully restored. So it varies. But what tends to be true is most people don't budget enough time for sleep.
Mhm.
Meaning maybe not 90%, but well more than half. And that would perform better if they just allowed even more time to sleep. And I think one of the things is what you do, right? Let's make sure that we don't need to wake with an alarm and cut sleep off somewhere in the middle of a sleep cycle, because
Mhm.
sleep comes in cycles that will usually have 4 or 5 sleep cycles over the course of a night, and each cycle will start off in deep sleep and then end up in dreaming sleep, and by the end of the night it's mostly the dreaming sleep, which is why we often are in the midst of a dream if our alarm goes off. So I think that would be one of the things is you know, um, start to go to bed earlier until you can wake naturally without an alarm, and see if that makes a difference in how you perform. But it usually makes a profound difference, and huge impact often on metabolic health, like weight, blood sugar, things like that.
Mhm.
And so, oh, I was just going to say, and
Yeah.
nootropics, the ones I've been talking about, like Qual Your Mind, is a beginning of the day thing. And what
Mhm.
often happens if we start the beginning of our day better, we end up having better sleep as a result. If we took something like caffeine at 7 or 8 at night, most of us, not all of us, I knew people in the Navy that could drink coffee and go right to sleep, but most of us, me included, don't do great if we have caffeine later in the
Mhm.
day. It disrupts sleep.
I think for many, we hear often is that people are sleep deprived. And I learned many years ago, and is that it is foundational to your point. It's like it is at the base of everything. And I fight for my sleep. So, in other words, when I say I'm going to bed, I'm going to bed. That's it. I'm done. And I just honor that need for me to function well, to do what I do. I need that sleep, to the point where our bedroom is dark. We don't have television in it. It's there. It's sleep. That's set up for that. And it took a long time to really realize that we think we can operate on less sleep, but can we operate and be, our best performing self on minimal sleep and enjoy the day? I think that's another aspect of it. Nothing is worse than yawning your way through a day and or forcing yourself to stay awake through a day. And the other thing I did was give myself permission to have naps at any time. And by the way, our team, we used to literally have a nap couch in the office, and anybody was welcome to go have a nap if that's what they needed to do, because the productivity is based on that. So it's just a kind of a side note as to what I've learned personally about sleep, and I'm sure that you've witnessed it many times with your clients, is that okay, we got a foundation, we've got product, we've got supplements, but let's take a look at the base layer of how you operate in the course of a day, and sleep has got to be there. Is that something that is that how you view it?
Yeah, well, and I alluded to, but I'll go into more detail. Like, there's some really important jobs the brain does during sleep. So, we could, maybe we were a student or we're at a job and we're spending a lot of time learning something. It's during sleep where that memory gets consolidated. Like
Mhm.
before that, it's almost like everything we learned maybe over the last couple hours before a nap, as an example, is stored in a short-term area of our brain. But during sleep is where it's moved to the long-term storage. And so if we're not getting good sleep, then memory, like we're maybe investing a whole bunch of time in trying to learn something, but we're not efficiently going to learn it. The other thing, and this happens much more in the dreaming sleep, is that dreaming sleep is where a lot of the tough things that happen in our life that generate emotions is where that gets almost like a free counseling session,
Mm.
where like if we had like if you or I today, maybe this afternoon, something really much more emotional happened to us, we're probably somewhere in a dream tonight. Our brain's going to try to make sense of that and work through it in a way that will allow us to wake tomorrow not being as affected by that same event or emotion. So
Mm.
if we don't pay enough attention to sleep, both our emotional, responses to things in the world and our ability to learn and remember are compromised from the day before, and we're not going to show up that next day as able to stay focused and as able to regulate our emotions and other things. So, yeah, sleep
Mm.
is profoundly important. And we actually have another an evening product called Qualia Night that was designed to help people that struggle with sleep get yeah, have an easier time falling asleep, staying asleep, and allowing the brain to do more work while they're in sleep. Because sleep, we think we're not doing much, but our brain's really active during sleep.
And so it really is about honoring your body and your mind. You'd mentioned it earlier, about pipeline and bandwidth and all of the things that happen if we get too much going on. And one of my triggers for me is overwhelm. If I'm feeling overwhelmed with things, because I know the mental state of overwhelm is that I'm looking too much into the future. I'm looking at the bigger picture rather than the smaller pictures. Like, so I know all the kind of mental hacks to break down overwhelm. But my observation with myself is that I have to consider, why am I being overwhelmed? Nothing's really changed. I'm busy. I like to be busy. I like to be productive. I like to do the things that I like to do. And so where does that sensation or that feeling of overwhelm, which then of course makes me a little more short tempered and or a little more abrupt, more direct. And sometimes I can trace it back and go, I need more sleep. Sometimes I'm not sure what it is. I'm just observing the fact that, what the heck is with the overwhelm, right? And sometimes my wife will bring it up. Stephanie will say to me, dude, what's going on with you? And I bring my awareness to it, and that sometimes helps it. But these are all little things that I think are signals that we have to pick up on. And what I like about these conversations with somebody like yourself is that we don't have to, there is solutions to it. There are things to consider. There are, in this case, conversations to be had and or supplements that can support. But ultimately it comes back to starting with the awareness that I can be better than this. I am better than this. I'm not dealing, something has to come into your awareness that says, I got stuff going on I got to deal with. And whatever that might be, whether it is a function of, a supplement or a mental state or whatever that is. I don't know quite where I'm going with that, but I guess at the end of the day, that really starts with first observing and saying, I'm not satisfied with my performance. I think I'm capable of more, or I know I'm capable of more, and things are happening. Is that a fair statement to make in terms of what would take me on a journey?
Yeah, I think awareness is all like for me always a starting point to get better in anything. And I
Mm.
know like even um so the way I would just describe it, if Greg is having sensations in his body that are strong enough for me to notice, then I always figure my main job is just to pay attention to them. Just put my
Mhm.
as much of my focus on, so maybe I feel like in this area of my head, tension building. Rather than
Mm.
label that a headache, then my job is to put some attention on it. Often that on its own will cause the symptom or that sensation to just evaporate, right?
Mm.
And the story I tell myself is I just would treat that like it was a little infant crying nearby. Like I don't know what's causing the infant to cry. I don't even need to know. I just need to reassure it, to hold it, right? To like
Mm.
pay attention to it. And so when I know for me, if I'm having sensations in my body, I just figure out my first job is pay attention to them. Often that's sufficient. Sometimes ask my body, all right, like, is there something, you need or you're trying to communicate? With
Mm.
that sensation of like a headache, it's often dehydration for me
Yes.
is the message I get, right? But it could be different for different people. I've seen, I remember a woman I worked with that had really debilitating migraines, except when she went on vacations and
Mm.
then none, right? And it almost seemed like a part of her was like, she was a mom, couple of kids, doing a lot to support the family as well. And my recollection is she was even aware, but it not consciously, that the migraines were almost a way for her to take a vacation from her life. Wasn't the best way for that to happen. It was a really unproductive way. But what she really needed was more of whatever that vacation meant for her, which was different than what it might mean for me or for you, right? And so I think often, like that sense of overwhelm you were explaining, right? Other people often around us will pick up before we are that
Mhm.
we're maybe, a little bit off our game, so to speak. But if we become aware of it and then just pay attention to it, and often, with that, we'll get some insight into maybe why we're feeling a bit overwhelmed. And the goal ultimately is to take actions early before things really build and become debilitating. And I think all of us have the capability for that. Some of us, like sounds like you as an example, have built a lot more skill in that area. And it would be one thing I would, wish for all of the listeners today, to
Mhm.
start to like build that muscle because it's there. And some of you may already be using it and have really developed abilities there. Others maybe not so much. But um, I know for me, the other piece I always think about is what's the story? So oftentimes, something will be going on in us and we'll have a story about what's going on. And my example would be I do not a lot and not as much anymore, but I've done a fair amount of public speaking in my career. Even did some performance dance back when I was at University of Hawaii, which I was not a good dancer, but I was
That's great.
like given that opportunity and did it in front of big audiences. And I can remember, so going back to that performance dance time, it would be opening night. I'd be out there with my partner. The lots of people in the audience. Most of that is kind of black. You could kind of see some heads, and you knew it. And I would have, I think, the same things going on in my body that someone might label as stage fright, like that. Sweating palms, racing heart.
Mhm.
But my brain, the story it always told is like, this is so cool. We get to do this just once, just tonight. Let's really be alive in this moment. Instead of a story of like, oh my God, I'm like gonna let these people down or whatever, right? So
Mhm.
I think that other piece is when something's going on in our body, and it's usually our emotions, right, that are going to be the clue. Like, what's the story we're telling ourselves in the moment, and is there an opportunity to tell ourselves a better, more gentle story about it?
I love it. Dr. Greg, I know that you've got a hard stop, so we'll wind this down a little short, so that we can get you on your way. And I appreciate your time and explanation. I love this conversation. And, my theme, my wife and I have a theme for 2024, which is clarity equals velocity. And when we start to understand kind of what makes us tick, being aware of all of these things and how we can be a version of our best selves, first and foremost, we start with the awareness of it. Secondly, we have to look and say, okay, what do I want to look at, focus on? Where am I not where am I breaking down? Where am I not being my best self and performing? Now, when people are listening to this, if they want to follow up with you, Dr. Greg, and or reach out and learn more about nootropics, where do we send them? Where are we sending people? Where would you like them to go?
Yeah, so our website is transitioning from neurohacker.com to qualialife.com. So QUALIA dot or qualia and then life
Yeah.
life.com. We do a lot on Instagram. So we put a lot of content about the brain and longevity on that. And on the qualialife.com, we have quite a bit that we publish, research on the brain, areas that we've talked about today, nootropics. So yeah, those would be the best places. And then I maintain the Qualia Life X account. So if you ever stumble on that, that would be me posting things on the X handle for Qualia Life.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put all the links in the description. And I love these conversations. One of my favorite topics is around holistic health and how do we look after ourselves better, and certainly how do we look after our brains better. Dr. Greg, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me today.